welcome everyone to Dr. Jasper, second attempt at our first session ever. Many apologies for the delay and technical difficulties that we had yesterday. It wouldn't be like a true doctor's office if you didn't have to wait longer than expected. So thanks for sticking it out with us today and joining us today. While I'm talking here, just for the next minute or two, I'm going to keep this poll open. As you probably know, this is our first ever Dr. Jasper session, and we are going to be doing this every month on the second Thursday of every month, not counting this month, obviously. And what we'd like to do is give you guys an option, a little bit of say as to what we actually present in these sessions. So we've presented these three options here for the next session. So if you could take a chance, take a quick moment to vote in the polling mechanism on Zoom and choose which one of these three topics you'd like to hear most from us in January. The next session will be January 9th, which again, second Thursday of January. And whichever topic wins here, I will close the polling here in a moment, and we'll let you know at the end of the session what we're going to be doing for the next session. As way of introduction, my name is Mike Belkowitz. I am a customer success engineer here at Jaspersoft TIBCO, working on the Jaspersoft product. I've been at the company a very long time, spent a lot of time in the professional services area, and I know a lot of people registered for the webinar are folks that I've actually worked with in the past. So thank you for joining. This session, we're going to be talking about domains. Here's a quick agenda of our session. We're going to be talking about what exactly is a domain, what should it be used for, what are domains not. Excuse the poor English there, but you'll see when we get there. Basically, I want to give you best practices, things to do, things not to do with domains as we go forward. Then we'll jump into a demo and show the new in 7.2. We updated our domain designer. For those of you that haven't seen it yet, we'll walk through the domain designer and try to cover as many of the pieces of the domain designer as possible. And then briefly, we're going to talk about some of the advanced topics that we won't have time to get to in this session, but I will give you some resources and links on some good info on how to deal with some of those advanced topics. We will address questions and answers at the end of the session. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A link in your Zoom meeting there, type in your questions, and at the end of the session, I will go through as many of those questions as I can. If we go over the time, I will stick around as long as necessary to try to address all your questions. And then we'll just show a couple takeaways with our key prescriptions and resources, like I said, links and stuff that would be good places to get started with Jaspersoft. So, all right, so last chance to vote on our next topic. I'm going to end the poll here momentarily. And all right, it is over. Okay. Now we're in the doctor's office. Welcome. We're going to play this up as much as we can. And I apologize if you see me looking over here. I got two screens, so I'm sometimes looking at the other screen. So we're going to jump right in. What is a domain? So from our user guide, let's see if we can do a little translation for you. A domain is a metadata layer that models and presents data accessed through a data source. So the easy way to think of that, in my opinion, is it's a subset of your database. But really only in the kind of logical sense. We're not creating a database. It's just a way to think of sort of like a view that you can build using our UI in Jaspersoft. It dynamically creates the query for you, which is controlled by the domain creator, the person who's building the domain, and of course our base Java code that's behind the scenes. Let's see. Oh, sorry, lost the link there. You can use domains to structure the data and present it in business terms appropriate to your audience. So business terms, really what that's saying is we're allowing you to limit and organize the data per your business requirements. So you may have a database structure that it doesn't make any sense to anybody but the DBA. But you have business analysts who are the ones that really need to access that data. And so maybe your data people, the DBAs or whatnot, can try to build that structure so that it makes sense to the business analyst for the use cases that they want to solve, the business questions that they want to answer. You can also limit the access to the data based on the security permissions of the person running the report and provide translations for static report text. So what does that mean? We can add security to our domains to limit the row and or column access based on all sorts of things on the user. You can have their roles, their profile attributes, their organization names. There's all sorts of things you can use to actually implement that security. And then, of course, you can do the translation with localization files. So if the user logs in with a different language choice, you can build in that translation for them as well. And of course, domains are in Jaspersoft, Jasper Report Server are used to create ad hoc views and reports. So those ad hoc views are the things that allow those end users, those business analysts, to quickly and dynamically create the reports to gain insight into their data without having to tax your company's resources to build individual reports. So it's a huge selling point, right, for Jaspersoft, because we say, look, you may have people developing reports, but they can focus on reports that are good for everybody. But rather than keep getting these piecemeal requests in from your end users, you don't want to constantly be building these one-off reports for your end users. That's the perfect use case for a domain. You build up a domain, you give a bunch of fields, access to fields, and then those end users can actually create the reports on the fly themselves. All right, so what are domains not? These are the gotchas. These are the things that I've gotten, in my time working with clients that I come across that cause all sorts of problems. All right. So we want you to try to avoid some of these things. This is the big one. A domain is not a catch-all concept to allow you to throw all of your data into one location for the end users. All right. What we have found is that if you give users access to a field, they're going to use it. If you give a user an access to all of your fields, they may use them. And what happens is they end up using the domain designer and ad hoc views as a more of an ETL tool to pull out all the data that they can get from your system and put it into their system. That's not the purpose of this. And you got to remember that with our base system, you actually are caching those ad hoc views, and that it becomes a big concern because your RAM requirements will go through the roof. You will have major issues. You can bring down your servers. I've seen it all the time. Customers call me because they're on life support. They're like, every time we're shutting down, we have to restart Jaspersoft every day because it's crashing. And we find out that A, they may not have enough RAM specified, and B, they've got these massive domains that users are pulling all the data for, and maybe even building a scheduled report based on all of that data. That's not something we want to do. Okay, we want to make sure we limit that data to a manageable size, something that actually addresses specific use cases and business needs, and it can address multiple business needs. But I don't like to hear, well, we don't know what our users need, so we're just going to put all the fields there. That's not what the purpose is, and that's not what we like you to, it doesn't perform well if you go that route. This is a tough one. This is one that some people may argue with me on, but I don't feel that a domain it's not best suited for your most technical and advanced users. What do I mean? Your ad hoc views and reports, which are based on those domains, they're pretty limited, right? And what you can produce, you can only produce a table, a crosstab, or a chart. And if you combine that with dashboards, you can sort of build a multiple thing that has multiple ones of those. But really, it's for that one specific use case, real high level kind of a touch thing. And plus, the UI is kind of designed for non-technical people. DBAs end up, calling and saying that, hey, well, how do we I want to put in my own SQL here. I don't like this UI stuff. Well, that's not the purpose of it. The purpose is to try to make it a little easier to use a UI to do your joins, to do, some calculated fields and some limiting, choosing which data is available to your end users. So that's the That's the kind of purpose on it. If you've got users who want to build reports with those multiple components or really in-depth advanced properties, then you're much better suited to actually use Jaspersoft Studio to build those reports, not ad hoc reports based on domains. Oh, and also complex aggregation and calculations are much more difficult, sometimes impossible to achieve with domains and ad hoc views. We do have the ability to do aggregations in there, and we'll walk through a little bit of that, but it's definitely one of those things that it's much easier to do in Studio or in your database directly. And then the last one, probably one of the most important things, a domain is not how you build a data warehouse, okay? Derived tables is a concept that we give there to you to kind of create a virtual sort of view within the domain, but they tend to get overused as well, and you really should use them with caution. The performance, again, it's dynamically generating the SQL, so the performance can suffer if you use too many derived tables and try to pull in all of your data in the format you want. Really, the primary concern should be build a proper data warehouse before you build a domain, excuse me, or reports in Jaspersoft. All right, so we're going to jump right into a demo. If I find the right screen, there we go. So for those of you that are new to Jaspersoft or maybe are using an older version, my hand disappeared, sorry. I'm going to, this may be new to you. The dashboard, the domain designer got a complete overhaul from the ground up in version 7.2 of Jaspersoft, which was released earlier this year. And it's definitely, it takes a little getting used to, but it's a much better user interface in my opinion. But the first step, I'm just going to walk you through real quick here, is to create a domain based on a data source. You choose your data source. If you hover over, if you have multiple data sources with the same name because in the different locations, notice if you hover over, it will show you the path to where that data source is, so you know which one you want to choose. In this case, I want to choose the public one. I'm actually super user here, and remember, only people with admin level and above can actually create domains. Regular users cannot do this. So once I've chosen my data source, I get a list of the schemas in that data source. First thing I have to do is actually choose a schema and put it over here in the selected schemas box. And once I've chosen that schema, you see I've got a little alert that says go ahead and select that schema to manage the tables. So now I've chosen the public schema, and I need to actually choose which tables that I want to present to my end user and build as part of this domain. So I'm going to keep it real lightweight here. I'm going to choose the department table and the employee table. If you guys don't know, Food Mart is one of the sample databases that we ship with. It's a supermarket, it's got everything related to supermarkets, including employees, customers, products, and all that. So just to keep this simple, like I said, I'm just going to choose department and employee. I can always change my mind, and move things back and forth here. Once I'm happy with what I've selected, I can actually take a look and just see, what fields are kind of available to me here. But really what I want to do next is go over to the Joins tab, because I know I got to join this data. I've got a department and employee, and employees are members of the department. So what I'm going to do is drag over the department ID from the employee, and then drag over the department ID from the department table, and now I've got my join. Very simple. You can choose different options on your joins. You can join on, if it's not equals, greater than, less than, etc. You can choose if you want left outer, right outer, full outer, or an inner join. And once you have multiple joins, you can actually choose the weight of those joins. So which one gets joined first? If you know your data well enough and you know which one will perform better by being done first, you can change that here. And that's a new feature in this UI. All right. Real quick, we'll go through pre-filters. You can actually pre-filter your data. Let's say you wanted to limit what data is accessible to the end user, and you say, well, I only want people who were, maybe this one is a male only or female only report. I want to just report on the female employees. I could pre-filter the data here. The thing about this is, when you do this, your end user doesn't know that you've done this. They don't ever really see a representation of that until they start showing data and they only see the females. So what I really recommend is when you save the domain name, when you save this domain and you choose a name, I would indicate that limitation in the name. That's just my recommendation there, because it'll make it a lot easier for users if you say, well, I've got my employee department data, females only, and that way they know what it is. Because if your users go in and they pre-filter, they filter their data and only show the males, they're not going to see any data at all, and they're not going to understand why. So now the important tab, I think, here is the data presentation tab. In this tab is where you define your sets and your items. All right, the sets and the items are what the user sees when they go to create their ad hoc view. In their ad hoc view editor, they're going to say create ad hoc view, and the first thing they're going to see is whatever you define here. So the easy thing, and what most people do, is they just drag over the entire joined tables. And you'll see here that actually went underneath department. I don't want that there. I'm going to drag it out. So now it's at the parallel level. And now they've easily just made access to all of the fields in the employee table and the department table. Okay, that's great. But again, that's where you can get into trouble. If your tables are huge and I know they're not going to care about supervisor ID, or maybe I don't want them to see salary. Well, make sure that's not there. You can just hit delete, the delete key, to actually remove individual fields there, and now they're not showing up there. And then the second important thing is this list here. This is actually showing you a lot of information, like what the user is seeing on the actual screen. So department ID is the name of the field. Maybe I want to change that. I can hit that little pencil and say, maybe I just want DPT ID. And you can also choose the field type. Now our system automatically says, hey, if it's a number field, an integer, or some sort of number, we assume it's a measure by default. But your IDs almost never are measures, right? You're not measuring on someone's ID. So you may want to go in and change those from measures to dimensions. And what that does is it changes where they show up in the ad hoc editor and what you can do on that. Some report types require a measure, right, for charts and stuff, but you don't want to use an ID as a measure necessarily. And then the other important thing is the summary calculation. This guy here actually is the default summary calculation. So if I decide to show totals in my report, let's say I have a table and I want to show the totals, it will default this and sum the IDs. That makes no sense at all. Why would I sum IDs? So because it was a measure, that's why it figured. So I can either change this to none, or for IDs, if I really want, I can maybe do count all or count distinct. I'm going to go ahead and just leave it to none at this point. So all of those changes, there's a lot of legwork here if you have a lot of fields, if you really want to make these look a little bit better. The underscores come from my database tables. If your database tables are like ours, they're not even this descriptive, so you may want to go through and actually change these names so it makes sense to the end users. Once you're done with that and you have a set, you can actually go ahead and save your domain. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And for this purpose, I'm going to go ahead and just put it in my public samples domain so it's available to everybody that wants to create an ad hoc view. And now I can go ahead and create an ad hoc view, and you'll see the mic domain that I just saved. I'll hit choose data, and here's the set that we just defined. If we expand employee, you can see that, oh, apparently my department ID didn't take. I don't know why that didn't take. That's strange. But I'm going to drag both of these over. We'll take a look at that in a moment. And when we go into the actual view, oh, there's the department ID. So the name took here, just didn't take on the set screen, and I know why that is. But you can see here it shows up under the fields, whereas my other IDs, I changed the department ID in the department, not the employee's department ID. So you got a kind of a duplicate data there, which I probably wouldn't want normally. But the other IDs are showing up as measures down here because I didn't change any of those. So now, obviously, if I pull over, information like this, and I set to full data, And you're going to see all female names. If I add in the gender, all I see are females because I limited that data. If I decide I want to change that, let's go back in and edit that same domain. And since it's an existing domain, I don't get that first screen where I'm choosing the data source and the schema and all that. It jumps me right into the data presentation section. And you see I added a department ID here. So I have it in there twice. That's kind of silly. I'm going to go ahead and just delete this one so I don't get confused next time. But now I can say, you know what? I don't want that pre-filter. I'm going to just delete that. And I go back to data presentation and I can say, well, I got some other IDs here. Maybe these are dimensions as well. And I can change those. A lot of times what happens in these larger domains is you decide that this is too tedious to edit everything here. One of your options is you can actually export the design of your domain. So if I click on this icon here, I will get a schema.xml file. And if I open that file, it's just an XML file listing everything in the domain. Now you have to be very careful here. You can absolutely modify anything you want in here, but if you screw up the XML, it won't import properly when you try to put it back in your domain. So just be very careful when you're modifying this. You can see here, department description added this attribute, dimension or measure equals dimension. So if I knew I had a bunch of IDs, here's an ID right here, I can pop in that same dimension or measure equals dimension rather than have to change everything on the UI in the front end. The labels as well. I can actually, change the labels here. And so on and so forth. You can go forward. The same thing goes for the aggregation value. You see here, it's a default aggregation is none, so you can add that in as well. Unfortunately, we don't show any longer the defaults unless you've changed one. So, you see there's no default ag for a lot of these, but there is for this guy because I changed it myself on the UI. So you kind of have to change it in the UI if you want to see what the other values are there to copy and paste them. Once I'm done making the changes here, file, and then I will go back and click this icon, import design, and choose that exact file to upload. And it gives you a nice big warning saying you're about to change this domain. You may be screwing other stuff up. If you've got other ad hoc views or topics based on this domain, they may get busted depending on what I'm doing right now. So just to make sure, in this case, I know I don't have anything based on it. So I went ahead and uploaded it. And now you can immediately see end date changed, birth date, the labels, ed level. These are now, these two got changed to dimension, the store ID and the supervisor ID, but I didn't change the default calculation, so I can change that in here. All right. Real quick as well, because we're running short already on time, is the ability to create a derived table. A lot of people talk about derived tables. The new feature here, you just hit this plus. It used to be a tab. Now you hit a plus and say create derived table. What exactly is a derived table for? Again, it's a way to kind of organize the data when you can't do it using our UI and your database isn't really allowing you to do it. You can do it if you had SQL, a way to do it in SQL. So the problem is, again, people get into trouble here because they say, well, I don't know, I'm just going to put access to my schema in here, and then I'm just going to write a derived table to get all the fields that I know are necessary. You just got to be really careful. When you create a derived table in Jaspersoft, the way it really ends up working behind the scenes is it creates an inner select statement to put whatever query you put here. And that can actually double up the time it takes. So the table scans, and depending on how you're doing things, it can double it up and actually really impact that performance. So the more derived tables you have, the slower your query can perform. And you can see that on the front end. If you have the View SQL button enabled in your ad hoc view, you can actually view that SQL and try to analyze it. And you'll see that most often, if you have derived tables, that's why your performance is not as good. I could create a derived table here. I just have to put a query in, an example. Let's see, I've got an example here that we can do. This is employee count by department. One of the nice features here is we were able to add a halving clause to it. We have no way to do that in our UI. So this is where it's checking and saying only want the ones that have more than 100 associated to it, right? And we're grouping by department ID here. And also we're doing a natural join rather than a regular join. So once I get that in here, I hit run query. I see my query results. I create derived table, and now I've got that over here as another option. And I can now drag that guy and see my employee counts in addition to the other data that I have accessible to me. So that's a good reason to maybe have a derived table, is to do some special work like that. So anything I do here now, I'm going to resave this domain, and I'll go ahead and create an ad hoc view again. Use my domain, and now you'll see I've got those two fields that came from my derived table. So I can actually just put those in, and because they're not joined, I did not add a join to either of my other tables, these get grayed out. So I would have had to add a join to be able to see the other employee data for this. So for right now, I'll just show you these two fields, and you're just going to see basically a count here per department ID. So here's each department ID, and there's their count. So that's how many employees are in each department. But again, only when we have at least 100 employees. So the departments with less than 100, we're not showing here. And real quick, let's go back. Whoops. And I'll show you that the join, which I neglected to add the first time. And the reason it sometimes takes a while to load is it's doing a little validation for you when it loads up, making sure things are still valid. So here, I'm going to go ahead and add a new join. Whoops. Oh. What am I doing wrong? Copy the table, contains the field. Oh, because of the data presentation, because I have this on here. I have to actually remove this guy first because it'll go part of this join tree before I can add that to there. So now I'm able to add whoops, that's not the one I wanted, the department ID. And again, that's a separate join. So you drag into the join tree. And now if I go to the employee, and I can join to the employee's department ID, and now if I save this guy, you will see now I will have access to the employee's data in addition to the department ID data. And I just realized I didn't add it back into the set, so we're not going to see all of the data. That did not serve my purpose. I apologize. So when I removed it from the set, it now is not part of the set anymore. So I can't see the count data that came from my derived table. So I'm trying to go a little too fast. I apologize. And so now in my data presentation, I can now, you see as part of my join tree, because I joined it now to the data, it shows up under the join tree. So now I can add this back in here and actually see that count data. So we'll save it. I will now create one more ad hoc view. And now that data is available to me here. So I'm going to pull that over. I'm going to pull the employee data over. And now I've got those counts. I could maybe do I can group my data. Whoops. So if you do have your data and you forgot to change it to a dimension rather than a measure, you can actually change that here and just say right click it and say use as field. So if I want to group my department ID, and I can see my column there. I'm sorry, the employee count. So I'm grouping that data, but now I can also add in other data and see like, let's say the names of the employees. This is a little tricky because now I'm showing the total in this column, but then all of the 100 employees in this column. So it's not exactly the best example, to be honest, but I can switch over to that employee, the count, and go ahead and get rid of the count. And obviously at the bottom of this guy, you will see my 100 employees were there for that total, for that department. All right. In the interest of time, I'm going to move forward. There are other things too that I'm not able to show you right now, and that's calculated fields and how to create those. I do have a quick slide that gives you a little reference on that. Let's just talk about that real quick. So these are the advanced topics that I was mentioning earlier, the domain security and localization. So securing your data in your domain, you actually have to create a domain security file and attach it to your domain. That's what allows you to limit the access via row level or column level based on the user's information. We have a link here that we will put inside the chat window, and will also be on the very last slide of all of the links that I provide here, which just points you to our security guide. That's the guide that actually talks about how to secure a data and domain. We also have this wiki article that was written. It's actually quite old, but it still applies, and it's a really good article that shows you how to define a domain security file. So I recommend taking a look at that if that's something you're interested in. Honestly, it can get quite complicated to build that domain security file, and that's why we don't really have time to talk about it here. Localizing data in your domain. It's possible to build and assign, I have a typo there, assign keys to your data so that the names of your fields can be localized per the language that the user chooses when they log in. So if they choose French, as long as you have a French translation built, then you can translate all of those field names into French automatically. You just got to build that translation file. And that's what we call the localization file. And that's actually in the localizing domain section of the Jasper Report Server user guide. It kind of walks you through how to do that. And the other thing that comes up a lot is the DOM-L syntax. DOM-L is Domain Expression Language. Remember, Jaspersoft is pretty much database agnostic. We don't care what database you're using for your data. But because of that, with all the intricacies of SQL and the differences between the databases, we had to come up with a way to allow you to type SQL in, put a function in, but have it translated to the SQL that's appropriate for your database. So this is what we came up with. It's a shorthand way of writing your complex queries. When you're building calculated fields and measures, either in the domain designer or in the ad hoc editor, because your end users can do that as well, they have to use DOM-L to do it. You can customize your DOM-L and add your own functions and your own translated SQL statements, but that's definitely a more advanced topic. And reach out to your salesperson if you're new, or your customer success engineer or manager if you are an existing client and you want help with that. We can definitely help you out. You can definitely get some reference here to to how it kind of works in the Jaspersoft, the Jasper Report Server user guide as well, and that will allow you to. It gives you a little bit of an insight of how it works. There's also a specific XML file that all of that is defined in. So if you really want to know how it works, I actually recommend you open that file. It's the application context security.xml, I believe. I'm sorry, that's off the top of my head. I should have wrote that down. But anyway, so those are a couple of the advanced topics that we don't have time. Obviously, I'm already over time to get to today. So I apologize for being a little rushed there, but I think we're ready now. We're going to open it up for Q&A and see what kind of questions we have. Again, if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A section of Zoom. And then also notice that Shane has thankfully put in all of those links that I just referenced into the chat window So again, let's see, let's go to the questions. Actually, we only have one question right now. The question is there a way to tune derived tables? The derived tables, again, are SQL statements that you're essentially writing and putting into our UI. We don't know what's in them, right? That's why it's an inner select statement when it gets translated. So Jaspersoft just basically takes whatever you put in and feeds it into the dynamically created SQL. So there is no way in Jaspersoft to tune a derived table. It's really up to you to tune that query and make sure it's as efficient as possible. Again, that may be affected by what other things are happening in that domain because it will get injected into the middle of this big kind of query. So what I recommend is using that view SQL option in your ad hoc editor. And actually, I think I can show that. Yep, so it's this button right here. And clicking that, and you will see the generated SQL statement. And in here, this is my derived table. So you can see exactly how this has worked because I joined the data from the derived table. That inner select statement is part of an inner join, and this can get a little hairy. So what I recommend is viewing this, highlighting this, copying it over to your database, and then performing your analysis there and trying to tune it actually in your database. Obviously, you can't change some of this other stuff necessarily directly, but you can affect the query that you write as the derived table. All right, we got some more questions coming in. Is there a way to determine the domain size in the UI? No, there's no way to know the size of the domain in the UI. And I'm not sure if you mean the physical size of the schema and the definition of the domain or the actual amount of data that's accessible to the domain. Either way, there's really no way to tell that in the UI. You can export the schema file and actually take a look at the domain size that way. That's usually not as big of a concern, and I see there's a follow-up question there that you've heard that domains, too big of domains are bad. That's kind of what I was trying to get at earlier on. It's not a data warehouse. It's not a catch-all to put all of your data there. What you can see is if you have the caching set on. So I just ran this ad hoc report based on my domain. Because I'm super user, I can go to manage server settings and I can look at the ad hoc cache and I will see, once it pulls up, these are the statements that have been cached, and all of these are today from me running those ad hoc views against the domain I just created. So what you can see here is how much memory is being used by the system for these particular ad hoc views. Now, that's not going to indicate your entire domain unless a user grabs all the fields and then puts it in here. Then you will see a lot more memory. You can see here, very lightweight for what I've done, but I only dragged a couple of fields over. If I dragged all my fields, it would be a lot bigger, and that's where you can get a good idea of how large your data set really is. But it's one of those things you really, really, really want to try to take care of while you're designing it. Because once people start building ad hoc views against your domain, you really have a hard time changing your domain because they're tightly tied together and we don't see both directions. The ad hoc view knows what the domain has. If you change what's underlying, it will break your ad hoc view. And the system will tell you that when you try to change a domain, much like when I tried to upload the schema and it said, hey, if you have any topics or reports based on this, they may break because you're changing the domain. Let's see. How would one handle the localization if the language is part of the result? How to change the label description dynamically. So that is a little trickier. I don't know that we'll have time to really address that here. What I can show you, which I didn't get to, is how to at least set the keys in the domain, at least so you get a little bit of an idea of how this works. I'm going to pull up that same domain I've been working with, and you'll see here in the data presentation file, you've got this right here, these bundled key properties. If I switch over here, then I can see what my label keys are. So I can actually set a key here. birth date, ed level, whatever I want to call these, but I'd have to basically enter all of these keys here, and then your localization file will actually be the translation. It'll say, well, if the key is birth date, then the translation is whatever the words birth date are in the language you're looking for. And you'd have to build a different file for every language. So generally what happens is you generate the key file, and then you actually hand that to somebody who actually knows the language and say, please translate this. And they'll just put in the values for the keys, and then that will translate these labels here. And that's all it is. It's just the labels here. It has nothing to do with your data that's being displayed. So if your data is in a different language and you want to make sure that this works for that language, then absolutely you want to build a localization file here and excuse me, and associate it with that file so that the translation happens. And if you look at this options tab here, this is where you add the locale bundle. So you can add your bundles here, and the bundles are basically one file for each language that you want to translate to. We do give you this ability to download a template, and you can see, and then, so I only had like 3 keys I added in there. I can say, go ahead and give me the missing label keys here. So now I've got this file, and here's my key file with all of the values, but you can see how ugly the keys kind of come out. It's fine if you want to keep it this way. No one sees the keys really in the end, but this is where your translation will be. So I would actually translate this, I don't know any other languages well enough to actually put them in here, but the point is you would have your translated language here. You save this as that version of the language, the bundle file, and then you will add those here, the bundles here. All right, we got a question, not necessarily about domains, but semi-related. Can you execute ad hoc views on a scheduled basis? You cannot execute ad hoc views on a scheduled basis, but you can execute a report that was based on an ad hoc view. So when you are in your ad hoc editor, you can create the view all you want, but then you can save it as a report, and then you can schedule that report, which is then, of course, tied to that ad hoc view. So yes, you can, but not an actual ad hoc view. Let's see, if domain designer fails, does that mean it's too big? That's a good question. It depends on why it failed. In the older versions of Jaspersoft, pre 7.2, the domain designer did this validation step that if you had a really large domain, a really complex domain, it could cause your system to kind of time out or even crash. I have seen that happen. And that's because the system is trying to validate all of the things in your domain. And it actually happened in more than one place a lot of times. It would happen when you opened it. It would happen when you saved it. There was actually a check validation button. That is something that we made great strides to improve on how that validation works with 7.2. So does it mean that it's too big? Not necessarily. I mean, you sometimes have to have a large domain like that. And in those cases with the old versions, what I told clients, one thing we would do is actually just disable the domain validation. It's a setting on the server that you can do. A little risky, right? If you're not validating your domain, but as long as you're careful when you're building it, that would cause that step to be ignored, and you wouldn't actually have it fail. But honestly, if it's crashing because it's so large and it's just crashing on validation, yeah, I'd say it probably is too large. Your domain's probably too big, and you might want to think about scaling it down to sort of smaller domains. Yeah, and I think I answered that last question there about options to skip validation of domains until the end. Again, you can disable it. Unfortunately, when you disable that option, I believe in the server, at least in the old versions, it's for the entire system. So you're skipping all of the domain validation. It's not per domain. And another question, can you put a runtime parameter in a left outer joined table? You can't put parameters in tables. I'm not sure I'm fully understanding what you're trying to get there when you say a runtime parameter. Are you saying filtering data into the system, like a filter from the report? Do you want to be able to put the filter into the table? I'm not totally sure. Arjun, if you can clarify that for me, I can definitely come back to it. Actually, that's the last question now. So one thing I do want to mention, Ninad put in the chat window, everything we're doing here is recorded. Obviously, we're going to be posting them to our YouTube channel. There's going to be a YouTube playlist that Ninad sent the link out to. Nothing is there yet. This is the first session. But what we will do is we will post those. I believe the way we'll post them is the initial half-hour session before Q&A. We'll post that as a link to the video link, and then we will post the Q&A section, I believe, separately, so people can, if they want to look at the Q&As, then they can do so. If I didn't get to your question or I didn't answer it properly enough, feel free to reach out. You can reach out, let's see, we have an email address that, oh, and I didn't even talk about key prescriptions, I apologize. All right, let me just put these on the screen real quick. These are things I already mentioned several times, but the key prescriptions that come away from this: keep your domains as light as possible. Overloading them will lead to performance concerns. Limit the use of your derived tables. Overuse can cause slowness of that generated SQL. And if possible, and this is true of anything with Jaspersoft and any reporting tool, build and maintain a data warehouse for your reporting data. It'll allow you to optimize the overall performance of the entire BI platform. It'll make things better, I promise you. It's extra work up front, but your end users will thank me, will thank you for doing that, because they'll see the difference in the performance. Here's the resources page. It just shows you all the links that we kind of discussed. We also have our customer success orientation page, which is a pretty good place to get started if you're new with Jaspersoft. We also have a good quick start guide here. And then link into our community site. If you want to post any questions on the community site, if you tag Dr. Jasper, that'll come directly to us as well, and we'll be monitoring that for questions and posting public answers there. And again, if you have other questions, you can email us directly at drjasper@tipco.com. And the last thing that, let's see, I have to look. All right, the winner for the next topic, and this is exactly what I predicted was going to be the winner, is, I'll grab the thing. Here's my thing. The winner is Visualize.js tips, tricks, and best practices. So please, please, please tune in for next January, second Thursday of January, January 9th, and we will talk about Visualize.js. We'll give some tips, tricks, and the best practices around our embedding solution. Those of you that don't know, it's one of the best ways to embed Jaspersoft directly into your application. And I think that's all I have. So everyone, happy holidays. I hope you all have a great break. Again, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. I know we had, like I said, some issues yesterday. Really appreciate you guys joining me today. And I hope everyone has a good rest of the day. And we will talk to you again next month. Thanks again.